All right. Hello, everybody. I think we're recording. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, my name is Helena Kirane. I am here with Tamara Dawit, who is the filmmaker behind the film Finding Sally, which I hope at least some of you have gotten a chance to watch before we get into this Q&A. How are you doing, Tamara?
Great. I'm really excited for this conversation and to chat with you and to take questions that people may have.
Yes, if anybody watching has any questions throughout the conversation, feel free to put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom page, and then we will get to them as we go along. All right, so my first question, I guess, just to set this up, why did you decide to make this film? How did the film come together from the beginning?
Sure. I mean, how I decided to make it was pretty much, for those of you who've seen the film, was what I say in the film. I found a photo of my Aunt Sally, didn't know who it was. It's the image that's behind me here on the wall, and then started digging into it. And I think why I decided to make a film was pretty quickly I realized that I wasn't the only person in the family that didn't have all the facts, and that there were also a lot of other younger people in Ethiopia who didn't know what had happened in that period, didn't know the impact on their family. So I thought there needs to be some sort of piece of content to give people more information and more access. And I thought that me investigating what happened to Sally would be a good entry point to look at the period, to look back and reflect on the Red Terror. And because I'm a filmmaker, that's basically how it became a film.
All right. I'm kind of curious, like, from what point of like kind of questioning and discovering what you found about Sally to like deciding to make a film about that, like how far along into that discovery did that decision to be like, okay, this is going to be the film? Like, when did you decide that was what you were going to do moving forward with
I
this?
think it was probably within like 10 to 12 months after I found out about her, because I had already been interested in that period and reading about it, and had no idea that there was any personal connection in my family. And I think it was really a conversation I had with my grandmother when I would go back to her and sort of pester her for more information about her experiences and about Sally, that it sort of dawned on her that it's usually problematic if I don't know, as part of the younger generation in our family. And my grandmother basically said, you need to document her life. You need to fill in the gaps and find out the things that we don't know about, because otherwise Sally and her husband and her comrades and her peers who believed in this better future for their country, their memories and their sacrifices will be forgotten. And it's a shame that young people don't know about what they tried to do, and that young people don't have the same energy in Ethiopia to try and change their country. And of course, it was interesting that my grandmother was saying this in maybe 2010, when there wasn't a lot of political activism happening at that moment in Ethiopia. And things have certainly changed. But it was really her encouragement that this has to be documented, this has to be remembered, that set me on the path.
Wow. Um, so what about in the process of like talking to everybody, I'm curious what the biggest challenge in making a film about a subject that so many people, both like in Ethiopia generationally, but also in your family, like are hesitant to talk about, like for justifiable reasons, upsetting, traumatic for both. But what was the biggest challenge in like trying to address it so directly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a few things. I mean, one, my grandmother was the head of the family, and my grandmother said to my aunts, we're going to do this. And when she gave that order, I think everyone sort of, for the most part, fell in line. Even those of us like myself who don't really like to be filmed, we decided this is a thing we're going to do because Mama would like this to be done. And that's sort of why the family took part. And I think, if you talk to my aunts about this, yes, it was stressful, yes, it's difficult to go back and think about these things, but it's really the first time they came together as a collective and remembered their sister, and had to deal with that and had to think about those things. So I think it was a healing process. I think to your question about what was more challenging, I think that's certainly investigating the other people in Sally's life, finding people who were members of the EPRP who are willing to talk to me. They don't know who I am. They didn't know that Sally had a brother or that she had sisters, and then that I'm this person in Canada who's contacting them saying she was my aunt and can I know more about what you did with her. I think that was a process that took a lot of time and to work and to build trust. But once I got one person willing to speak to me, that it sort of started to snowball, that more and more people would come out. So I talked to maybe 15 or 20 different people who had been in the movement with her in the 70s to really inform the background that I was able to paint about Sally, even down to small details about, what was she wearing or what were some of the other things she was involved in during that time.
Wow. So you said did you say in 2010 was when you started this project?
Yeah.
So almost like a decade long endeavor. Wow. No, that's incredible. Um, so the film kind of does two things. It's kind of centered around your family's remembrance of Sally, but it also kind of takes you through a pretty comprehensive timeline of Ethiopia in the 60s and 70s before and during the Red Terror. Did you always know that you were going to put both of those aspects in that way into the film? And then how did you go about balancing both of those like kind of stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think the balance is the editor. That's how that worked out. I mean, it's not an easy process to think about how are you going to mix together different layers of the same story, because of course, just telling Sally's story wouldn't really make sense to most audiences internationally, and also younger generations in Ethiopia who just don't know about what happened in that period. So there had to be I guess, some sort of like historical anchors and markers to help people understand where you're starting from, what big moments are changing in the country to where you ultimately end up at the end of the film. And I think also because the film had a broadcast partner in Canada, which is the CBC, they had a lot of editorial commentary on how this film was going to be an opportunity to explain Ethiopian history to Canadian audiences. So that's why there's a whole sort of chunk at the end of the film that jumps from sort of where the film to me more naturally ends, with the sisters going north to where Sally lived.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that chunk that talks about what happened after the fall of the Derg, up until, not even up until now, but up until a year and a half ago when we stopped editing. And that was really because we wanted Western audiences to be able to relate the past up to the present.
Okay. Was that you said when how did you, I guess, find that all that, I think, stock footage from the 60s and 70s, because that stuff is so good. There's like a lot that you were able to like add in there. I'm just curious where you got a hold of that.
I mean, a lot of places. It's a lot of sort of dedication and patience to searching. But I did work with three core partners in Ethiopia. One is the Red Terror Memorial Museum. So there's less of their content in the film, but there's more of it now on the website, findingsadly.com, which is a lot of the archives that they had in their collection, which were the Derg era sort of propaganda magazines. There's images in the film from the Ethiopian Press Agency's archives, and there's also a lot of footage in the film from the Ethiopian Broadcasting Authority. So it was just sitting and digging and looking and finding things, as well as pulling footage from all of the sort of archive houses around the world.
Wow. Yeah, no, I was very struck by a lot of that footage. So that's incredible. Was there a moment during the making of this film, or I'm curious even after, as you've been showing this film to audiences, that has like particularly stuck with you?
I think definitely the moments in making the film, because there was a lot of things that are, of course, somewhat planned. Like I know that I'm going to interview my aunts, and I know I'm going to ask them these questions. They didn't know about the things I was going to push back on and say, like, how did you feel? Or would you would you still have done the same thing today? But I had a good idea of what they were going to talk about. So the things that were sort of more unexpected or risky was when I took my aunt Kibra to the house where she was detained, which is the house of the Pankhurst family in Ethiopia, who are friends of my family. And no one had really made the connection that that's where she had been held. So that was a scene where we didn't know what was going to happen. And I think it's a beautiful, like, intimate moment. Also, the same with my aunt Kibra when we were in the north and she was with her sisters. We didn't know she was going to start calling out for Sally in the mountains. But for me, those are the two favorite scenes in the film.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess because as you said before, you're in it, like you're narrating and you're very visible. It's kind of in a big way, like your journey of discovery throughout the film, uh, throughout the whole thing. But in those kind of tougher, more powerful moments in particular, what was it like to kind of be present, but also be like behind, kind of thinking in both ways, being present and knowing that you're directing a film still in the moment?
I mean, I would never advise anyone to be in the film you're directing and producing. That's too many hats to wear at once. But I think also that me being in the film, me sharing the story through my perspective does also help audiences connect to it and sort of find Sally as I'm finding her. So I think it adds to this specific film, but it's not something I would recommend because it is, as you say, you're wearing like multiple hats and you're thinking about your characters. And I was thinking a lot also about like the duty of care, not so much for my aunts, but specifically for my grandmother and Sally's mother-in-law, because I knew it was traumatizing to think about these things, but they were both really adamant about wanting to be in the film, to talk about their children and to make sure that their lives were remembered. But we also wanted to make sure they were well situated, to be emotionally supported after they gave those interviews.
Wow, yeah, no, I think that's, I can't imagine how much difficult that must be. But did you always know that you were gonna physically be in it or be present in that way? Or did that kind of decision come organically or inorganically after you had decided to
No,
make
I
this
think
film?
that was a decision that, I mean, it was not my intention from the beginning because I'm an introvert. So I saw the movie in a different way when I was initially trying to finance it, but also the way that the financing structures work in Canada for documentary. It's pretty much that you can only finance a doc that's that sort of like personal narrative point of view film. So that came into play, that the only way I was going to be able to actually make the thing was by putting more of my voice and narration into it. I did initially try to film it in a way where I was much more obscured, that you were still seeing it from my perspective, but I wasn't with these sort of like straight to camera shots. And then when we started editing, we realized we needed to see me more. So there were some of the pickup shots where you see more of me, but I'm still trying to hide as much as possible.
Yeah, no, I'm very similar. So the fact that you were so present in it really stood out to me, and I applaud you for doing that. Whether it is like the most comfortable thing or not, I think it does. Yeah, I see how it's like such a personal story, and it is like you can see like the so many people, your family, the country's journey, but also your journey throughout. Um, how I'm curious how you were able to like um kind of figure out the things that you and your family didn't know. Like, was it just mostly like, did you get to the end of this mostly by just like reaching out and communicating to people who had been Sally's friends who maybe hadn't had conversations like this before, or like what did you actually need to do to like kind of get the answers and reach the ending that you do in the film?
I mean, a lot of it came from the people I spoke to who would give me information that then I would have to take and try and verify again with someone else because I wanted to try and have multiple sources telling me the same thing, to try and check it as much as possible. But I was also reading books about the period that mentioned Sally or mentioned her husband, or for the books that were written in Amharic, having someone else read them for me. I mean, my grandmother is the one who read a novel called Simba Fakir, so the love of a Simba, or for the my love of Simba, or something like that, which was in Amharic. It's now been translated into English, so I've also read it, but it talks about Sally being like a getaway driver and being armed and being involved in this assassination attempt on Mengistu Haile Mariam, the dictator, which no one in the family knew about. And my grandmother just casually mentions that she's read this in this book. So I tracked down the author and I tracked down other people who were involved in that moment to try and get more information about it. So a variety of sources, and maybe also just completely dumb luck that when we went to the north, I went up multiple times before we filmed there with my aunts to the village where Sally spent her last years, and the amount of people there that remembered her and remembered her husband and were repeating, the same stories to us was really, really incredible.
Wow. I guess if you're like I'm kind of curious about like kind of in that sense talking about like the idea of people like talking and communicating um these ideas. Oh, actually, okay, I had a question, but I actually do want to save it for later. So we have a question from the Q&A. I'll read it out loud. Can you talk about Mengistu, his role, his life after being dictator of Ethiopia? What were the role of US military in setting Mengistu up?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not the right person to answer all the specifics of this question. I mean, the thing I would say that I found really, really interesting about Mengistu is the fact that he's completely evaded persecution. He's still living in Zimbabwe, and then no one seems to want to return him. And I'm worried now that if he was returned, I don't know that he would actually face any sort of punishment. Which happens also often with so many people like him who've done really, really heinous things. I don't know a lot about the involvement of the US military in his removal, or in, I guess some people have said that they've helped to sort of facilitate his escape to Zimbabwe. I don't know, because I really didn't study that period. I really focused on the Red Terror, and how he came into power and what happened in 1977 and 78.
Okay. Oh, and just a reminder again to everybody watching, if you do have like questions that you'd like for me to ask, you can drop them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them like we just did that one. Is there anything that you discovered through through the course of making this film about either your family or about Ethiopia, or anything that you would like to explore more in the future in a film or otherwise?
Hmm. I mean, I'm producing another film now. It's not a doc, it's a drama that's set in the same period, because I think there's so many other stories to be explored from the Red Terror and from the revolution. And I think that it's really important for Ethiopians to look back and reflect on the past and dissect it and question it and discuss it. And I think when we don't do that, we set ourselves up for failures going forward. And I think the other thing I'm interested in dissecting through film content is secrets, because I think culturally we keep secrets, and essentially this film is about a family secret that I tried to uncover. And I think it's interesting to think more about why do we keep these secrets, and how the secret keeping is often tied to pain and tied to trauma. And I've always, looked at this film and thought my aunts didn't intentionally not tell me about Sally. It just was something that became so ingrained within them because they were protecting themselves from these traumatic memories.
Yeah, I think the idea of secrets and all that was like that resonated with me, in the way that I think that's what was like so interesting to me about this film, was just it is just directly addressing everything that is like just going about it in a completely opposite manner. I think, okay, we have another question. Okay, how do you feel about what's happening in Ethiopia currently, specifically within the context of the documentary Sally's Aspirations for a Better Ethiopia and Ethiopia's contemporary history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my biggest disappointment in the release of this film is that because of COVID, we haven't been able to do a full and proper release in Ethiopia because I really, yes, the film was financed in Canada. That was the way to get the thing made, but I made it for Ethiopians and Eritreans to watch it, specifically Ethiopians in Ethiopia and young people to watch this because I feel that, you know, as I said before, we lose so much when we don't know our history. And I think the themes in this film about building a better country, about the importance of critical thought, are so needed and necessary right now, especially as the country's heading into an election. So I wish I wish there was a way to do more screenings in Ethiopia right now, but we're working really hard to get the Amharic language version dubbed, and it will be airing hopefully in the spring on television in Ethiopia because I think this reflection right now is more critical than ever before.
Yeah, I had a kind of similar question, I guess, that you partially answered, but I guess how would you like viewers to kind of recontextualize the message of your film for these times? Because it seems, you know, very, when we're talking about history is not discussed and whatnot, um, and you know, the message of that message very clearly comes through in your film. But like, is there any way to, does the message change at all for these times the way you see it now that it has been released and then
I mean, I think for me, the message is about critical thought. And I think sometimes we just don't have the time or have the ability to think about these things. And I think when I was researching this film, I went to the university in Addis and I went to the history department and I said, is there a master's or PhD student studying the revolution, studying the Red Terror, someone that can come and work with me? And the dean of history was just like, we don't study that. Like we study ancient history. We don't study contemporary Ethiopia. And to me, that's, you know, for me, that's the whole problem in a nutshell. If you don't look backwards, it's like we're a country that's like driving at full speed on the highway and never looking in the rearview mirrors. And that's why maybe it's just because I'm someone who loves history and I think we can take lessons from history that I feel so passionate about that. But I think that also the message of the film, I've tried to not be maybe so direct about it. And I think it's for people to watch and take form their own opinion and look at the film and think about, you know, who was right, who was wrong, who had the best ideas, who didn't. And also perhaps, you know, what version of Sally do you believe was the actual version? Because my aunts also present sort of different sides of Sally, and we don't really clearly say who was she, and that's quite purposeful.
so going back, I guess, talking again about your family, how did making this film affect or change your relationship with like everybody in your family that you talk to, but also like your relationship with Ethiopia as a country? How did your kind of relationships and understandings of the people in your life and Ethiopia change and transform throughout this process?
I mean, I think I spent a lot more time with my family than I probably would have otherwise, which was good because that meant that as an adult I got to actually get to know my aunts as someone that was becoming, or at least I was seeing myself as their peer versus how I knew them when I was a kid and I'd be looking up to them and usually be afraid of them because I didn't really know them that well because we didn't grow up in the same country. Um, and I think also making the film gave me an opportunity to spend more time in Ethiopia. I've been living in Addis since 2016. Right now, I'm in Toronto because of COVID, and I need to be online and working to promote the film. But I'll be back there hopefully by the end of this year. So I think it's those things that it gave me the opportunity to be closer to my family, be closer to the country. And I think it was also important for making the film to be able to spend so much time in the places where Sally existed.
Has do you have any like when it comes to the communication, the kind of openness, like the family secrets and whatnot, do you feel that like throughout this process that has kind of broken that barrier, and that like that is a family change that you've seen, or do you think that is like a harder kind of habit to address?
Yeah, I think that that's a harder thing to change. And I mean, a lot of younger Ethiopians have messaged me, sent me emails to say, like, how did you get your family to talk about this? I can't believe you asked them this or that. And I think a lot of it has to do with maybe that as much as I'm Ethiopian, I'm also Canadian. And I'm quite blunt and quite direct. And I didn't really think about, oh, is it not appropriate to ask your elder these things or to push back or to put them on the spot? Because I genuinely wanted to know and I thought it was important, just try and get to the root of the issue, so to speak. But I think my aunts opened up because I was pushing them to open up. I don't think they would have done that on their own.
Did making this film with them together give your family any closure, do you think, involving Sally?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, there's a scene we filmed that didn't make it into the actual movie, with the ants in Addis after they've come back from this journey together. And one of them sort of commented that we've never sat together and talked about Sally in 40 years. You know, they'd never done that. Maybe they'd done it, two of them together, or not at all, or they've told some of their children some aspects about Sally, but there had never been a sort of family conference to remember her.
Mhm. Um, is your we got to, see and meet so many of your family members. Is your aunt still painting? The one who we got to see, the artist?
You know, I don't know because I spoke to her about 2 weeks ago, and that was one of my questions. I know right now, well, I guess now she has a lot of her grandkids living with her, and they had been home with her for quite a while because of COVID. And she hadn't been doing anything for herself. So part of me calling her was to say, like, what's going on and to nag her to make sure, like, now they've gone back to school. So you need to start doing these things again.
Right. We have a question. For your next narrative film on this subject, are you writing the script? Do you have a title?
No, so I'm producing it. I mean, that's the other thing. I'm primarily a producer. The reason I directed Finding Sally is because it was so personal and about my family that it didn't make sense for someone else to do it. So the majority of the films I work on are with other directors and primarily Ethiopian directors.
Wow, that's great. That's incredible. I guess this is a similar follow-up question, but is there, besides this film that you've mentioned producing on, is there anything else that you're working on now or have planned for the future that we can keep an eye out for?
I have a few other films in production and that are shooting right now, but I'm not going to say too much about them until we finish actually filming. I think, you know, the other thing that I've been focused on working right now is really more extension content around Finding Sally, because I know that there are so many people who were affected by the Red Tear and haven't had their stories documented. And this film was really only the story of what happened to my family, and a little bit of what happened to Sally's mother-in-law. So I'm in the process right now of raising money so that I can go out and document more stories, because I think it's important for us as Ethiopians to have an archive of this, very much like how for the Holocaust, the Jewish community has a huge archive of memories and testimonies to that period. And I want us to have the same thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Really quickly, I want to remind anybody watching, if you have any additional questions, um, things to bring up, you can put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom or just in the chat even, as we continue. So you've said, so you haven't shown this film in been able to show it in Ethiopia yet, but you've been showing it. How has the reaction been just in general outside of Ethiopia with everyone that you've been able to show this to?
So the film has screened in a lot of festivals, and actually a shorter version was broadcast on Al Jazeera back in November, which did bleed into Ethiopia. And that sort of started the avalanche of requests to see the movie in Amharic and to see the full film in Ethiopia. But I think the responses, I mean, the two most frequent responses I get are people who come up to me and say they knew Sally, they knew her husband. Sally was my teacher because she taught at a high school for a while, or I know someone in your family. Um, and then also a lot of younger people or people my age coming up and saying, how did you get your family to talk about this? Or I've seen your film and now I'm going to ask my own aunt or my father or my grandmother. And the same, you know, people who are my aunt's peers saying, I've never talked about this to my son or daughter or my niece or nephew, and I'm going to go and talk to them about my experiences. So those are sort of the core pieces of feedback I've gotten or responses.
That's incredible. When I think that would be like, I mean, there's so much as this like film continues to be shown that could occur, but I think even like the legacy of like, you know, asking questions, getting, you know, people to kind of talk about things would be like so, like alone that would be so powerful. But of course, like I'm sure so much more could come. What do you think Sally would think about the current state of the world and Ethiopia now?
You know, that's something that I asked all of my aunts. And also Sally's friend Fukurta, when I was interviewing them, I asked each of them, what would Sally be doing if she was here today? And it was really interesting because even though we didn't end up putting that in the film, all of their answers were different. And I realized that they were basically reflecting themselves onto Sally. So my aunt that was a teacher said, you know, she would have gone back to teaching and just been a teacher like I was in the US. My aunt who worked for the UN thought like, you know, she would have done the same path as me, trying to change the world through this sort of UN NGO career. And then her friend said she'd still be fighting for a better Ethiopia. So it was really interesting. Like if my aunts liked the current government, they would say that Sally would like the government. And if they didn't, they would say, well, you know, she would have concerns. So it's hard to say. I think that when you look back on things in the past and when they look back on their sister, they're also looking back and remembering her in an image in a way that they can be comfortable with today.
Mhm. Thinking back, I guess, thinking more about like this image of Sally, as you talk about all her aunts speaking about her in this, but also like throughout the film, and like the image of Sally that you are kind of creating with this film, the image that you had kind of conceived of, or did you have any idea? Oh, I guess not, but let me think what I'm trying to say. The image of Sally that you kind of construct in this film, um, you talked about it not even really being like a holistic, not necessarily like a holistic or complete image, but what did you think it was going to be when you were starting? And then how did you feel at the end of the process of making this film about what you had, this kind of document of her you had created?
I mean, I think when I started out, the bits of information I had from my aunts was much more in the direction of, oh, Sally, you know, was impressionable and wanted to help people. And she met this guy and he took her away from us. And, but, you know, she was a nurse, so she was trying to be helpful, which I don't think is the full story. I'm not even really convinced that that's the correct story. I think that the Sally I actually found is someone who was in control of the things she wanted to do and believed in the things she was doing, and clearly was doing many things beyond just being a nurse. Um, but for me, the image of Sally that I see mostly in the film is one of hope. And that's sort of the thing I always remember and I take from her memory is her hopefulness and her belief in a better future.
We okay, another question from the audience.
Mhm.
Okay. being from a well-to-do family that have traveled broadly overseas, especially the way that she embraced the counter-revolution and the way that she changed her lifestyle, opposite of her comfortable upbringing, and given the well-to-do status of your parents, do you feel may have been running away from that? Do you feel she may have been running away from that lifestyle? I think that was the
Um,
wording.
I mean, I don't know. She definitely switched. She definitely sort of threw off, I guess, the trappings of her more privileged lifestyle. But I think also some of the things I've learned about my own family, that yes, they grew up abroad, but they weren't really rich. A lot of the embassies didn't have a lot of money to survive off. So my grandfather was offering services like through the embassy to basically balance the budgets. And part of the reason why my family didn't stay in Canada that long, or at least my grandparents, was because the imperial government couldn't afford to keep the embassy open, and that's why my grandparents were sent to work through the embassy in Sudan, and my aunts and my father stayed in Canada and had to work to pay for their livelihoods and continue in school. So as much as my aunts paint this really fancy, lavish picture, I feel like I've started to see through some of those things, that they had a lot of access. They had a lot of, as one of my aunts would say, we had, after when they were living in Canada without their parents, we had all the nice things. We had the nice cutlery, we had the nice glasses for our wine, but we were drinking water and eating, white bread with mayonnaise because that's what we could afford. So I think there was definitely a bit of that going on. And I think also that Sally's change or transition was really hard on my family, especially because it was dangerous for my grandparents. We're really lucky that nothing happened to my grandfather specifically when Sally went missing, that it was only my Aunt Kibra that was taken and arrested. Um, I know that was sort of the key concern of my aunts when Sally went underground, was what was going to happen to our parents, and how could you do this because it's risky for the family.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that completely answered that question, but those are sort of the things that were coming to my mind about that.
Yeah, no, I think it sort of does kind of those contrasting lifestyles. Um, Another follow-up question was, did any of your siblings join Sally in her quest? That may have been.
Yeah, I mean, none of the aunts did. Sally did send one letter when she was in Asimba, which went to my Aunt Memby, and she was asking her to come and join her. And Memby sort of wrote back and said, I'm very busy with the things I have going on here. I think she was in school at the time. And there's an article on the Finding Sally website where I talked to Memby about what it was like living in Canada when there were so few people of color, so few Black people when they first moved there. And she reflects on that letter and she says, I kind of regret that I didn't go there, because once I found out that she passed away, I always had this nagging feeling. Had I gone, could I have done something? Could I have saved my sister?
Wow. Um, does anybody, if anyone else watching has any questions, uh, feel free to add them as we kind of wrap up. But do you have anything you want to say about the film as it continues to be seen and shown to audiences, and hopefully, makes its way where it needs to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I always tell people is, I know it's maybe not the first thing people look for, but I love the music in the film. That's something I spent a lot of time on. I really wanted to give Sally a voice in the film because we didn't have any audio recordings, any video footage where we could actually hear what she sounded like. So that's why I collaborated with singer-songwriter Zaki Ibrahim to sort of appear through her voice as Sally throughout the film. We did a lot of research on the music from the period. So there's samples from a death song that the Derg used to play on the radio when they would announce the names of people that had been killed. There's also a sample in the score from the EPRP anthem that Sally's peers told me that they used to sing when they were marching in the hills in Asimba. So I guess my suggestion is, if you didn't watch the film, watch it with really good headphones so that you can hear all of those things, because for me, it just adds completely another layer to the film.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much in this film that gives the story and Sally so much texture. The sound, the music definitely being a big part. We have a few questions. What did you learn from Sally, and what do you think she would want young Ethiopians to know or learn from her experience?
I mean, I think what I learned from her was just the importance of hope, and the importance of really being engaged politically. And I think that's something that's challenging right now in Ethiopia and in many countries in the global South, because there isn't um, a pattern of teaching critical thought and political engagement. And there isn't always a diverse representation of political parties that are even, have the funding to exist as a party and have a platform so that you can get to know them and understand what they're proposing and what they're offering you. So I mean, those are the things I think about a lot, about the importance of those. And I remember back to some of the research I was doing into the period, and I remember reading that I think in 1975, had there been an election after the Derg first deposed the emperor, that it's quite likely that the EPRP Sally's group would have won in many of the urban centers. And I think that's really interesting to think about and reflect on.
Someone's asked, what are your thoughts about Haile Selassie?
I think I have a lot of thoughts about the emperor. I think it's interesting because I'm someone who grew up hearing about him. I think the way that I heard about him, the way he was remembered, certainly by my father, was it was really glamorous. It was really positive, and I think it wasn't until I was an adult and I started doing more research, and certainly when I started working on this film, that I realized, he's just a guy, despite what our Rastafarian brothers and sisters may believe. He's someone that exists in shades of gray, and he did some things that were really wonderful in terms of setting up the African Union, setting up Ethiopian Airlines, and some other things that aren't that great. And those are some of the things that led to him being overthrown.
Someone has a question, I think, about something you mentioned earlier. What was the name of the book that you mentioned that mentioned the attack on the airport that had been translated into English?
Yeah, so the book is called Asimba Fikr, or the Love of Asimba. I know it's for sale on Amazon in the US. That book doesn't talk specifically about the Bole airport bombing. That book talks about assassination attempts on Mengistu in the same period. The Bole airport bombing is something that one of my aunts found out about because she received a letter that was sent to her in a newspaper clipping of sort of like a wanted ad that referenced Sally in connection to that.
Okay, well, unless we have any questions. Oh, okay, we got one more. Your grandparents seemed very patriotic. Is that accurate? Where do you think they got this sense of duty to serve Ethiopia and want their children to be so well educated?
Yeah, I mean, my grandparents are incredibly patriotic and nationalistic. Even though if you look back into my family history, we come from a variety of different ethnic groups. My grandmother is actually from Eritrea. If we go further back in my grandfather's history, he's, I think, from Syria or from Yemen. We're not entirely certain. His father. But they were always very patriotic. That's why my grandfather worked in the foreign service. That's why he was an ambassador. This was what they felt was important for them to do, to work to better their country. And it's something that they ingrained in all of their children, that you're Ethiopians, even though we're living abroad now, or you may go abroad for school, you should go back and work for your country. That's something he told everyone. that's why if you look at my aunts today, they've all gone back to Ethiopia. I think Sally just took that direction in a different way than everyone else.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note then, unless we get any last minute questions in the chat or in the Q&A, I would like to thank Tamara for being here for this discussion and really giving some incredible insight into this film. For anybody who has made it to this Q&A who hasn't watched it for whatever reason, I highly, highly recommend you watch it. It's a really powerful film. So I want to say thank you once again to Tamara. And I would like to encourage everyone here to check out the rest of the films this weekend and join us Saturday at 10 p.m. for our closing celebration for the festival. Yeah, thank you, Tamara.
No, great. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions.
All right. Well, I hope everyone has a good night and enjoys the rest of the festival.